Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Potashnik, Chair of the Political Science Department, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to our final distinguished lecture of the fall semester, and also looking forward to the series continuing in the spring. We already have lined up two great speakers, Herman Mark Schwartz from the University of Virginia, who will be giving a talk on international political economy, and Jake Grumbach from UC Berkeley, who will be giving a talk about American politics and democracy. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Jessica L.P. Weeks, who holds the H. Douglas Weaver Chair in Diplomacy and International Relations at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She received her PhD in political science from Stanford in 2009. Her research and teaching interests focus on the links between domestic politics and foreign policy, the domestic and international politics of authoritarian regimes, and how public opinion affects foreign policy. Her book, Dictators at War and Peace, was published by Cornell and explores the domestic politics of international conflict and dictatorships. And it was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the best international relations books published in 2014. Her research has appeared in many leading journals, including the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, International Organization, and World Politics. She is the 2018 recipient of the prestigious International Studies Association Karl Deutsch Award, which recognizes the scholar under age 40 who's made the most significant contribution to the study of international relations. It's a real pleasure to have her here today, and I should also mention that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Watson Institute. So welcome to Brown.
Thank you so much. It's been such a warm welcome here, and many of you have asked me if this is my first time at Brown, and I've been here two other times. One time when I was about 17 years old and I was looking at colleges, but my parents and I fought about how much money they were going to pay for college, and I went to Ohio State, so that worked out fine. The second time that I was at Brown was in February of 2020. It was February 24th. I looked it up. After I left, a global pandemic started. And so I was just thinking back to that time. And so I have these amazing memories of Brown being like the before times, before we kind of holed up for 4 years. And it was that I looked at the front page of the New York Times to try to see what were the pandemic headlines at the time. And it wasn't a pandemic yet. At the time, it was in Italy. We were all very sad for Italy. We were all saying, "Oh, darn it, we can't, visit Italy this summer," not realizing where exactly it was going to head. But so I hope that I don't trigger another global pandemic on my second visit. I'm hopeful that it will not be the case. But thank you so much for having me and for your hospitality. It's been wonderful meeting with your students and and getting to know all of you. So today I'm going to talk about a small piece of a broader project that's about foreign electoral intervention, broadly speaking. And so this is work that is co-authored with Mike Toms at Stanford. And it's part of a bigger project trying to answer a bunch of questions about this thing called foreign electoral intervention. So what do we mean by that? There's different types of electoral intervention. Sometimes it's really good, right? So there are foreign interventions to try to help countries develop democratic institutions, to monitor their elections, things along those lines. Other times, electoral interventions are maybe more questionable from a normative standpoint. In this project, we're focusing on the more questionable side of the spectrum, and we're looking at cases where foreign countries intervene with the direct goal of trying to influence the outcome of the election, right? And from the standpoint of a leader, as I'll explain in a little bit later, this can be really attractive, right? Because it's a way to essentially influence the foreign policy of a foreign country if your intervention is successful without firing a shot. So can be quite tempting to foreign countries. Now, it's been in the news a lot because obviously, as we all know, the US has been a target of electoral intervention in recent years, and it seems like this is something that's still happening. In fact, Russian officials saying pretty openly that that's still what they're doing today and will continue to do in the future. What's a little bit maybe less well known from the public side, and certainly not by you, but it's also that the shoe is sometimes on the other foot. Sometimes the U.S. is the one doing the intervening. It was especially notable during the Cold War, but it's actually something that we still do today. And you can think, in recent years of U.S. presidents endorsing foreign leaders, which is a form of intervening in the election of another, if they're standing for election at that time. So it's something that lots of countries around the world are doing. So in this particular project, we are studying how the U.S. public thinks about this thing, countries intervening in foreign elections to influence the outcome. So I want to defend that a little bit, like, why are we doing this? And so the first question is, why do we study how the U.S. thinks about foreign electoral intervention? Why are we focusing on electoral intervention and why in the U.S.? So the first is something I've alluded to already, which is that foreign electoral intervention can be this very powerful tool. As I mentioned, it can be a way to influence who comes to power in another country, which then influences that country's foreign policies and also that country's domestic policies. And that's true both when other countries are trying to do it to the U.S. and also when the U.S. is doing it to other countries. But there's also obvious downsides to this, right? So foreign electoral intervention can be normatively bad. If we think that it's inappropriate for foreign countries to be influencing the elections in other countries, then it undermines norms. There's certainly lots of evidence, some of which I'll talk about a bit, about how Americans think about that. They tend to think it undermines norms, even relatively low-key versions of intervention like endorsements. It can also harm democracy because if foreign countries are doing things that people think are normatively bad, then it undermines their confidence in the outcome. They start to think, well, maybe this election doesn't represent what the American people really wanted. It's actually reflecting the will of a foreign power. And so they start to doubt the legitimacy of their electoral system and whether the people that win the elections are actually there legitimately. So it can be hurtful to democracy. It also can polarize the public. So one thing that we've observed in past work and that I'll show you some of today is that different people looking at the same episode of electoral intervention can come away with very different views as to whether it's a bad thing. And even what exactly happened and whether that was harmful, but depending on what side of the political aisle they're on. So it doesn't just harm democracy, it actually can push people in the target country away from each other, where people are yelling at each other across the aisle thinking like, how can you not see things the way that I do? And one of the things I'll show you later is that there's not one political party that has a monopoly on that. So that's across the political spectrum that people tend to polarize around this. And then finally, electoral intervention can increase international tensions. Obviously, it harmed the U.S. relationship with Russia when Russia intervened in our election, and it has harmed the U.S. relationship with other countries when we've meddled in theirs. So the stakes for understanding sort of when this happens are pretty high. And then why study the U.S.? Well, the U.S. is a global superpower, and the stance that the U.S. takes on this and whether the U.S. engages in it or invites it is going to shape global norms and perceptions about whether it is a legitimate tool of foreign policy. So we want to know, is this something that the U.S. may be doing in the future, and if so, under what circumstances? Okay. So then the second question is, well, why study what the public thinks about this? After all, the public's not the people organizing and carrying out these interventions, so why are you studying what Americans think about this? And so I do think that studying the public can tell us a few different things. So first of all, it can tell us about leaders' incentives to do things like intervene in foreign elections, something that we have a separate project on, or to solicit foreign intervention in our elections. Oh, it's blowers. Okay, like, what did I do? So today I'll be talking about the soliciting aspect of this, but understanding what the public thinks helps us understand when leaders might be tempted to invite this kind of intervention, and also whether they'll do it secretly or out in the open. Understanding what the public thinks can also tell us something about whether U.S. institutions are working, right? So if we observe that the U.S. intervenes in foreign elections, or if we observe that U.S. leaders are inviting foreign intervention in our elections, then we want to know, well, is this totally going against the grain of what the public actually would want if you ask them about it? Or is this actually kind of in line with what the public is okay with? So in order to judge that, we need to know what it is that the public thinks. It can also, we think, and maybe this assertion is a little more controversial, we think it can help shed light on what leaders might do, even if they're not thinking about public reactions. So there's really interesting evidence showing that the difference in how ordinary voters and political elites react to these kinds of experiments are actually quite small. And so looking at ordinary voters and seeing how they react in the case of today's presentation about soliciting foreign intervention can shed some light potentially on, or at least give us clues as to what leaders themselves might think about this. And then finally, it can tell us about sort of the future of democracy, right? So if we think that electoral intervention or soliciting electoral intervention is more likely when the public is perfectly fine with it because leaders aren't worried about the backlash, then we're likely to see a lot more of it. With all of those attendant consequences that I talked about earlier on the downside, right, of undermining faith in democracy and polarizing the public. So we use experiments on US voters to study 3 related questions. So this is sort of zooming back to the broader project before I zoom in to the narrower question. So a first paper already published, I won't really talk about it formally, although I'm happy to tell you what we found if you're interested, is about how Americans react when foreign countries intervene in US elections. And I've already kind of hinted at our findings there, right? So we find Americans don't really like it. It polarizes them. It makes them lose faith in democracy. But interestingly, it doesn't provoke the kind of retaliation that normal military interventions can provoke. So that paper sort of shows why this would be very tempting on the side of the intervening power to want to do this, because it achieves multiple goals that could be valuable to the foreign country. I don't even think I've talked much yet about the fact that historical research shows that these interventions can work. So Dov Levin has some really fascinating work trying to estimate the bump that candidates get when a foreign country tries to help them, and it's about a 3% bump on average. Now, of course, like, hard to know exactly is it 3% or not, but anything in that vein would certainly be enough to sway a close election. So that fact, together with what we found, you can see why this would be very tempting to foreign countries. The paper that I will talk about today is about how the public reacts when US political candidates solicit the foreign help in their elections, so when they actually ask for it. And then a separate project looks at how voters react when the US is the one intervening in a foreign country. And I won't have time to talk about that today, but if in the Q&A you want to hear a little bit about what we found, I do have a few slides prepared and could show you those findings. And so I think this is a really important topic, and there's been surprisingly little written about it. I don't know, it just hadn't maybe caught the academic imagination that much until recent years. So we try to fill that gap. The part of this broader project that I'll talk about today is this second question of how do Americans react when US candidates solicit foreign intervention? And so, as I mentioned a moment ago, the intervention can help the favored candidate. Dov Levin found about a 3% bump over in the history that he studied, which was mostly during the Cold War. Right, and so that can create incentives for candidates to seek out that intervention. It can be quite tempting for them. On the other hand, though, so we can see the upside. On the other hand, though, there's the potential downside, which is that you could provoke punishment if American voters recoil against the soliciting, then this could completely undermine the request or any benefit that you might have gotten from the intervention happening. So this prompts us to ask two questions in this paper. So first of all, to what extent do voters punish candidates who solicit versus just look the other way, right? So we do know that from prior work that voters disapprove of foreign intervention, but we don't know whether that disapproval changes when it's being invited, and we also don't know whether Americans actually act on that by withdrawing support from the candidate that they would otherwise want to elect. And there's lots of kind of depressing evidence from American politics that voters will often hold their nose or just look the other way if it's a question of defecting from their preferred candidate to uphold the norm versus pursuing their policy or partisan goals by staying with their candidate. So we just don't know to what extent voters would actually do this. And then, in addition to estimating the overall penalties, we try to learn about the different situations in which those penalties might be larger versus smaller as a function of things like the relationship that the U.S. has with the foreign country, what exactly, if anything, the U.S. candidate offers in return for intervention, and also partisan dynamics. And so we do this for three reasons. So first of all, we think it can help us explain when foreign interventions are likely to occur. So one thing I didn't mention yet is that interventions are typically inside jobs, in the sense that foreign countries rarely intervene unless they have a candidate on the ground that will in some way help them. So this is, again, drawing on Dov Levin's really excellent historical work during the Cold War, and he found that it was very rare for either the US or the Soviet Union, the interveners he was studying, to actually invest in an election unless they had some support on the ground there, because you need, in order for the intervention to be effective, it's much easier if you have people, either the candidate themselves or people close to the candidate, to kind of guide you in what would be most effective. So unless you have one side being willing to help, they're unlikely to happen. So understanding when candidates might be tempted to actually invite it can help us understand when the interventions will occur. It can also shed light on whether politicians will just invite intervention out in the open or when they're particularly likely to do it secretly. And so one of the conclusions that we draw is that certain types of intervention will be less likely to observe out in the open, but there could be incentives to carry them out below their radar. And then, for reasons I already mentioned, to the extent that we think this is normally bad or has bad consequences, it helps us know sort of how depressed to be about the future of American democracy. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about our empirical approach. So these are interesting questions, I think, but they're very hard to study with historical observational data. And so there are three problems, and these are kind of common to a lot of social science questions, but I think particularly strong here, that make it hard to, say, collect data on historical interventions and then, soliciting of interventions and then see how voters reacted. So the first is this classic problem of selection bias, which is that candidates probably have some estimate of what the public reaction will be, and of course they're going to be more likely to solicit when they think, for whatever reason, that might be hard for us to measure, when they think that they could avoid punishment. So the cases that we actually observe are not necessarily going to be representative of what the punishment would be if you looked at all potential cases of soliciting that could have happened. So classic selection bias problem. And so when we think of episodes that we did observe, it's possible that this is plaguing what we actually see. That, for example, in the famous Trump-Zelensky case in 2019, that Trump was anticipating that maybe the penalties wouldn't be that bad. Now, we can debate were the penalties bad or not. That's sort of going to be a theme of this paper, is the glass half empty or half full? I would love your input on that. Okay, second problem is that although we can observe some historical cases like Trump reaching out to Zelensky, we just don't have that many cases, and we don't have enough cases to be able to figure out things like, does it matter who solicited, right? So we saw a Republican presidential candidate, who was an incumbent, soliciting help from a friendly country, Ukraine, a certain type of help with a certain type of potential quid pro quo, but we don't know what the situation would have looked like if it had been a Democratic candidate approaching maybe a less friendly country, or maybe avoiding a quid pro quo, or maybe having asked for something else. We just don't have those cases to be able to answer the types of questions that we're interested in. And then finally, classic political science problem, confounding. It's just difficult to isolate the effects of, say, Trump having made this phone call to Zelensky from all of the other things going on during 2019, like lots of other things happening. So for these reasons, we use survey experiments, which allow us to administer hypothetical situations to people that vary all of these factors, and then to estimate what the public reaction would be in different situations. And so we fielded 3 experiments for this project, pre-registered. We fielded them earlier at the very start of this year. One in which a U.S. presidential candidate, so we call it the pure solicitation experiment because there was no doubt about whether the candidate had solicited. We informed voters that this had happened, and there was also no elite rhetoric about what had happened. And then we follow that up with what we call the elite justification experiment, where we see what changes when you give elites a chance to criticize and defend the candidate for reaching out. And then finally, we look at what happens when you inject doubt about actually what happened into the events. So the first 2 experiments describe the soliciting as a fact. They just describe what happened. The third experiment, it injects some doubt by saying that there was a report and saying that political opponents doubted the report, and so seeing how that muddies the water. So I'm going to start now by laying out what our theoretical expectations are that justify these 3 different experiments, and then I'll give you more results probably than you want. Okay. So first theoretical question is just overall, on average, would voters punish candidates that solicit? And so our hypothesis is that yes, and it's because soliciting can provide information about exactly the kinds of things that we know from, say, American politics research voters are trying to figure out when they're deciding which candidate to support. Right? So if you look at the American politics research, there's kind of 3 core things in a lot of models of voting behavior. So do you think that the candidate is good, ethical, shares your moral values? Do you think the candidate is competent? And do you think that you and the candidate share important policy positions? And so I won't belabor the logic here, but we basically argue in the paper that soliciting would harm judgments about all of these things. So to the extent that voters think soliciting and electoral intervention are wrong, this would tarnish judgments about ethics. They may also think soliciting foreign intervention is a pretty stupid way to win an election, and so therefore may question the candidate's judgment and competence at something as basic as running a good campaign. And it could also tarnish their proximity, their perception of policy proximity, particularly on foreign policy, right? So you see a candidate reaching out to a foreign country, you may wonder, hey, does this candidate feel the same way I do about the sanctity of our foreign relations and how we should be conducting them, things like that. And so because of the tarnishing of judgments that an episode of soliciting could elicit, we think that voters would respond by punishing candidates that do that. And so this seems reasonable, but I do want to point out that there are 2 reasons that this might not be the case. So the first is that maybe candidates don't think soliciting is such a big deal, and therefore it doesn't actually change their perceptions of ethics, competence, and proximity, right? So to the extent that voters think that this is just business as usual, or something that they that candidates do all the time. It might not, or something that's just not inappropriate, right? Because we could have a moral debate about whether we should be allowing foreign endorsements in U.S. elections or even other forms of political involvement. There's actually a whole realm of political philosophy that's really interesting about that question: who has a right to participate in elections? So we could debate that, or it could be that voters don't like soliciting and it makes them think candidates stink, but that the extent of that effect is just totally outweighed by other goals, ideological goals, partisan goals, wanting to see your party thrive, or policy goals, maybe wanting to get a candidate in that will do whatever the policy goal is that you would like. And so there's interesting evidence on that from the American politics that looks at how U.S. voters react to sort of homegrown norm violations. So not things involving foreign involvement, but just things like gerrymandering or intimidating journalists. And the sort of depressing conclusion of a lot of that research is that voters actually tend to prioritize those other goals and not to punish norm violations. So it's an open question which of these would prevail. Okay, we also develop hypotheses about what the candidate offers, if anything, right? So one of the big things in the Ukraine affair was that Trump had offered a quid pro quo. And a lot of the political debate was about, was it a quid pro quo? Was it not a quid pro quo? Did it matter if it was a quid pro quo? So we only have, as I mentioned, few cases to look at. So it's interesting to know, did this actually matter in that case, and would it matter in others? And so we hypothesized that quid pro quos would kind of have a similar effect to intervention in soliciting in general, in that it would hurt your judgments about things like ethics, competence, and policy proximity, right? So a candidate that's sort of holding U.S. foreign policy hostage for personal gain is going to seem less ethical, potentially also less competent, and certainly less likely to share Americans' foreign policy preferences than one who just asked for a favor without offering anything. But again, kind of an open question, voters might think either that quid pro quos are kind of run-of-the-mill, it's just politics, you're the incumbent, you make foreign policy however you would like. Or they might think that an explicit quid pro quo isn't required, because if you make the request, you're already holding yourself hostage. So they might just think, they might be assuming that there's an implicit quid pro quo even when we haven't mentioned it. So those are both reasons that we might not observe quid pro quos to have an effect. And then finally, we looked at differences in terms of who the US candidate approached and whether the target was an ally or a non-ally. And so along the same lines of the previous theory, we hypothesized that the penalties would be bigger for approaching a non-ally than an ally, largely because it's sort of seen as morally wrong to associate with badness like a non-ally, and also that holding U.S. foreign policy hostage has much worse consequences when the target is unfriendly than when it's a friendly country, one of our close friends. But again, kind of an open question. One thing that's interesting here is that if you actually look at U.S. laws about foreign involvement in politics, they don't care at all about who the target is. It's illegal or illegal. It depends, actually. It's kind of disturbing. But it certainly doesn't depend on who the foreign country is. So, voters might take that perspective as well. Okay. We then looked at the role of rhetoric and uncertainty. And so we hypothesized that punishment would be less if elites justified the candidate's behavior, rushed to the candidate's defense. And that makes a lot of sense, but we decided to focus our analysis on situations of two-sided rhetoric, because in real elections, that's what you're most likely to see, where you'll have members of the candidate's own party defending the soliciting, but you would also see members of the other party criticizing the soliciting, explaining why exactly it's so awful. So you might wonder, well, maybe wouldn't the counter-rhetoric offset that? We actually think it doesn't offset it, and the reason you'll see more clearly once I show you the data But basically, punishment comes from your own party. And so while it's true that counter rhetoric could influence the other side, it doesn't influence the people that are imposing the punishment. And so we actually think that, so we predict that justifications will have this one-sided effect of just reducing punishment among the inside party while not affecting punishment on the other side. And then we also look at how voters react when there's questions about the facts. And so we predict that the punishments would decrease when there's uncertainty about what happened. Sort of motivated reasoning will cause people to choose the interpretation that aligns with their side of the political debate, and reduce punishment when your own candidate solicits. Okay, I'm almost done with the theory part. We also were really interested in differences across political parties. So we hypothesized, and maybe this was too starry-eyed, that Democrats would punish more, right? So, okay, so on the one hand, you might think there would be no difference. So, for example, the research from American Politics shows that Democrats and Republicans are pretty similar in the punishments that they mete out for those homegrown domestic norm violations. But we thought, hey, the Democrats just impeached a president for soliciting. They are definitely going to punish more, right? Because the Trump presidency and the impeachment polarized voters about what it means, how bad it is for a foreign country to become involved, and how bad it is to ask for that. So we predicted two things, actually: that Democrats would levy more punishment, and also that they would be less successful at defending solicitors. So Democratic candidate solicits, you would think then Democratic elites come in and say, actually, this was okay, wasn't that bad. Democratic voters, you would think, would say, come on, that's totally hypocritical. How can you say that? And just dismiss that. So that was our prediction, and we'll see what the results said in a few minutes. And then finally, we predicted that there would be partisan double standards. So here, it's not so much about whether punishment would be different depending on party, but more about judgments about whether the soliciting was wrong, unethical, illegal, things like that. And we predicted that voters would judge soliciting more harshly when it's the other side's candidate doing it than when it's their own candidate. And then I'll talk later in our findings about the interaction between elite rhetoric and those double standards, which kind of has an interesting pattern. Things kind of get worse when you allow elites to speak. Okay, so getting to the data. So I'll start with our first experiment, the pure solicitation experiment. Okay, and again, just to preview, this was the experiment where we call it pure solicitation because there was no doubt about whether soliciting had occurred, and elites did not have any chance to speak. So this is just presented as facts. So we fielded this experiment to 3,000 US respondents, representative of the demographic distribution of US adults via the survey company Lucid. And so we presented our respondents with hypothetical scenarios involving the 2024 presidential election. Okay, so just this past January for next year's election. And so for each scenario, we randomly paired one real Democratic candidate against one real Republican candidate. And so we tried to, as of January 2023, and as you can imagine, lots of heartburn about who exactly to pick. We looked at polls and kind of who seemed like the most plausible candidates. For the Democratic candidates, we picked Biden, Buttigieg, Harris, and Sanders. And for the Republican candidates, Cruz, DeSantis, Pence, and Trump. Okay, as of 2023, those were still plausible. Things have changed a little. Okay, so our experimental conditions. The control condition involved no mention of seeking foreign help. So it just paired these candidates to each other and asked people some questions that I'll show you in a moment. And then in the treatment conditions, we had one of the candidates seek foreign help. And then we randomized which candidate asked, so which side, Democrat or Republican, the country that they contacted, whether it was a friend or foe. I'll give you more detail on that in a minute. What exactly they asked for. So we had different kinds of help that they could be asking for. And then whether or what they offered in return, if anything. Okay, so our procedure for doing this is that each of our participants received multiple pairings, right? So this, you can already see, could get very quickly out of hand in terms of how much data you need. So we had each participant evaluate 4 control pairings. So those were the ones that didn't mention any soliciting, and that didn't mention any soliciting, and then 2 treatment pairings in which there was soliciting. And then we compared preferences in the treatment versus control groups. So let me give you a little more detail about all of that so you can see what we really did. Okay, so first in the control pairings, this is an example of one of the control pairings. Suppose the presidential election were held today, and the main candidates were Kamala Harris, Democrat, and Donald Trump, Republican. Okay, so respondents would see exactly something like this, just with randomized who the candidates were. And then we measured support for the candidates. And we did this in a couple of ways. So the first just looked at their preference between the 2 candidates, forcing them to choose one or the other. And so the options were strongly prefer the Democrat, slightly prefer the Democrat, slightly prefer the Republican, or strongly prefer the Republican. But then we also looked at voting intentions. And so we asked them, all things considered, what would you lean toward doing? Vote for Kamala Harris, vote for Donald Trump, not vote for president at all. Because that then allows us to see a little closer to the voting decisions that voters might take, and allows voters to opt out of supporting either side, essentially. We also measured perceptions of the candidates, right? So our theory was all about how soliciting and different features of soliciting could tarnish your perceptions of the candidate's ethics and their competence and your policy proximity. So we asked them to say, all things considered, would you describe the candidate as unethical or ethical, as incompetent or competent, and would you describe the policy positions as different from or similar to your own policy views? And then we measured each of these on a 7-point scale. So to reiterate, respondents answered these questions for all of the control pairings, and as you'll see also later for the treatment pairings. Okay, so now on to the treatment scenarios. So we randomized who asked, and so if you remember, each respondent got 2 treatment scenarios. We always had them have one of the treatment scenarios be a Democrat and one be a Republican. We randomized, of course, which order that was in. And we also made sure that each treatment scenario had 2 new candidates that they hadn't seen previously. So we were careful not to have them, because we didn't want the scenarios to taint each other. So they never evaluated the same candidate twice. Okay. We also randomized the country that they contacted. So it was either an ally or a non-ally. And so to simplify things, we did this by naming the foreign country and making it concrete. I see you laughing. Who's not an ally or non-ally? Is it good? Is it right? Okay. So the allies we chose were Australia, Canada, France, Japan, and the UK. And then the non-allies we chose were China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Syria. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, we allowed the nature of the request to vary. So it could either be the candidate asking for a public endorsement, which is just inviting or asking the foreign country to say that it preferred them and hoped they would win the election, or to buy turnout ads, so anonymous online ads that would encourage the candidate's party to members of the candidate's party to vote on election day, or to take out positive ads, so online ads that would praise the candidate, negative ads to buy ads that would criticize the opponent, or to investigate the opponent in their own country to figure out whether the opponent had broken laws or acted immorally. And so we tried to pick things that would be plausible for candidates to ask for, and that had some real-world resonance for that reason. Okay. We also varied whether or not there was a quid pro quo and what the content of the quid pro quo was. So half of the respondents received the no quid pro quo treatments. They didn't say anything about this or said that they wouldn't offer anything, but half of the respondents offered a quid pro quo. And in those cases, the candidate promised that if elected, he or she would return the favor either by inviting the foreign leader to visit the White House, or an economic quid pro quo, signing a trade agreement that would help the country's economy, an institutional quid pro quo where they would use their influence in the United Nations to help the country's foreign policies, or a military quid pro quo to actually redeploy the US military in ways that would serve the foreign country's interests. Okay. And so putting that all together, here's an example of a treatment scenario. So the main candidates in the 2024 US presidential election were Joe Biden and Mike Pence. During the campaign, Biden sent a private message to the leader of China. In the message, Biden asked China to buy anonymous online ads criticizing Pence's character and policies. Biden promised that if elected, he would return the favor by signing a trade agreement that would help China's economy. China has not yet responded to the message. We always had the foreign country not yet respond. We kind of wanted to hold that constant and leave that out to simplify things. You could obviously think of extensions that would tell you about what the response was, et cetera. Okay, and so then in these treatment scenarios, we measured all of the same things that we measured in the control conditions. So we measured preferences, prefer this candidate or that candidate, voting intentions, would you lean towards voting for this candidate, that candidate, not voting at all. And then we also measured perceptions of ethics, competence, proximity. Okay. Experiment 2, the elite justification experiment, was very similar. So we fielded this one just the following month. The control pairings were exactly the same as they were in the pure solicitation experiment. But the difference was that in the elite justification experiment, subjects were exposed to this elite justification instead. And so if the soliciting candidate was a Republican candidate, subjects read the following text. Republican leaders said candidate's message was completely appropriate and legal, and that candidate had done nothing wrong. Republican leaders also said candidate's message would have no effect on the election or on US relations with country. And then as I mentioned, because in real elections, voters get exposed to rhetoric potentially from both sides, we also had a rebuttal from the opposing party. And so the rebuttal when the solicitor was a Republican was Democratic leaders said that asking a foreign country to get involved in our elections was unfair, unconstitutional, and dangerous. They said Republican leaders were repeating the mistakes of 2019 when Republicans defended Donald Trump after he asked Ukraine to investigate his opponent, Joe Biden. So as you can see, we tried to sort of make the best case rebuttal that we could given the real history that had happened, because we knew that that was going to be in people's minds, so we leaned into it and made that rebuttal. And then when the solicitor was a Democrat instead of a Republican, you see very similar text here. Democratic leaders said candidate's message was completely appropriate and legal and that candidate had done nothing wrong. Democratic leaders also said candidate's message would have no effect on the election or on US relations with country. So you can see that's identical essentially to the Republican messaging. The rebuttal changed just slightly, again, to draw on the fact that this had happened in the past. So Republican leaders said that asking a foreign country to get involved in our elections was unfair, unconstitutional, and dangerous. They said Democratic leaders were being inconsistent and hypocritical because in 2019, Democrats impeached Donald Trump for asking Ukraine to investigate his opponent, Joe Biden. Okay, so again, testing our hypothesis that Democrats wouldn't be able to get away with this given the impeachment of 2019, 2020. Finally, and then I promise we will get to findings, we had the contested report condition. And so, right, in the previous two vignettes, we had presented the soliciting as a fact. Now we injected some uncertainty about what had happened. And so instead of just informing people of what had happened, we instead presented it in this way. We said, during the campaign, the U.S. intelligence community released a report which concluded with high confidence that the Democratic candidate had sent a private message to the leader of the country. So we modeled this on the kind of language that U.S. intelligence agencies actually use when they are pretty confident that something has happened. And then we went on further. High confidence means the report was based on high quality information from multiple sources, but was not certain and might be wrong. Again, this is modeled on actual U.S. intelligence community language. And then we gave elites a chance to speak. If the solicitor was Republican, then the Republican leaders contested the report by saying it was full of lies and its conclusions were false and it was a partisan smear, essentially. And we allowed Democratic leaders to respond by saying, no, 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 clear and overwhelming, totally unbiased, and nonpartisan. And then if the solicitor was a Democrat, we just reversed those speeches. So in this case, there was no asymmetry between the rhetorical conditions. Okay. What did we find? Okay, so just to explain how we estimated the effect of support. So if the first quantity is support for candidate A over candidate B when neither candidate solicited, that's the control condition. And then the second quantity is support for A over B when A solicited but B didn't, that's the treatment condition. Then we calculate the effect of soliciting on support by subtracting those two quantities. And we average over the context, so the other variables and pairs of candidates, although later we'll sort of pluck out different comparisons. Okay, so the average effect overall across our experiments was 9 percentage points. And in the appendix, we show that this was because of the perceptions of things like ethics, competence, and proximity. So again, what this means is that averaging across all of the data, candidates who solicited lost 9 percentage points on that preference variable compared to the identical candidate not soliciting. As predicted, we saw that quid pro quos made things worse, or put the other way, that candidates could downplay the punishment or could mitigate the punishment if they avoid an explicit quid pro quo. So if the candidate asked with a quid pro quo, the punishment was 11 points. If they asked without a quid pro quo, it was about 8 points, and the difference was about 3 percentage points. And then we also found that candidates could mitigate the punishment by asking an ally. So the punishment was 12 points when they asked a non-ally, but only 6 points when they asked an ally. And the difference between that was 6 points. And you might be wondering, well, what happens when candidates do both? If they ask a non-ally and avoid a quid pro quo, and the punishment was still about 5 percentage points and highly statistically significant. So it didn't disappear there. Okay, what about, yeah? This is the preference dichotomized. We found very similar findings for the vote choice. The effects were slightly smaller. Okay, so then the elite justification experiment. This is when the candidate's party doesn't question what happened, but just defends the candidate, and the opposing party criticizes the candidate. We found that the elite justifications shrank the punishment somewhat, but the punishment still existed, and the quid pro quos and alliance, the nature of the target still mattered. And then finally, we saw again that the effects were similar and the patterns were similar, but smaller in the contested report. So that's when there was doubt about what had actually happened. And so just a little bit about robustness. I want to get through all the results. So just we looked at the vote choice dependent variable. We found interestingly that in the vote choice dependent variable, what was happening is not that voters were defecting to the other side. They were just saying, I'm not going to vote, vote at all. I'm going to stay out of the election. We also wanted to see whether the effects held among the voters that might be most politically important. We found very similar patterns if we restricted the analysis to voters or people in swing states or people that were very politically engaged. We found that the effects held when we dropped Trump from our experiment and other candidates, so it wasn't driven by the inclusion of any of those particular 8 candidates. And in general, we found that the conclusions held for most of the candidates in most of the situations. Now, caveat here, we're slicing our data super thinly, right? Because we're throwing out 3/4 of the data. If you're looking at just one candidate, we're throwing out a huge amount of data in the treatment conditions and the control conditions. And so a little bit of caveat there, but we found that the effects seemed to hold for most candidates, except for Trump, who seemed to be able to get away with this. And you can think of why that might be, which is people already were pre-treated with this information. They knew what had happened in 2019. But in some of the situations, there was actually no punishment at all. Okay. So then findings by party, I'll just zip through them. So if you recall, our first hypothesis was that Democratic voters would impose more punishment than non-Democratic voters, than Republican voters. And so what we show here is the top figure shows the percentage of Democrats that would support the Democratic or Republican candidate in each condition. And so you see a few interesting things here. So first is that as expected, when the Democratic candidate did not solicit, then 89% of Democratic voters supported that candidate, so highly partisan voting. You also see that although there is punishment, 3/4 of Democratic voters are still sticking by the candidate even when that candidate solicits. This is averaging across all of the combinations of ally and quid pro quo. The other interesting thing that you see here is it really drives home where punishment is coming from. And punishment has to come from your own party, or maybe independents, because those are the only ones where there's vote share to lose, right, by doing something bad. And so, yeah, Democrats don't like a Republican candidate who solicits. They only support that candidate by 9 percentage points, but they weren't voting for that candidate in the non-soliciting condition anyway. So the punishment's not coming from there. The bottom figure here shows you, it just calculates the size of the punishment in each of those conditions. So it's just directly derived from the top figure. And what we see is that punishment of Democratic candidates by Democratic voters is 16 percentage points. Okay, so moving on to Republican voters, what is fascinating and maybe depressing is that we see exactly the same thing. The punishment, Democratic punishment was not any larger than Republican punishment, even though Democrats impeached a president about this a few years prior. So we see very similar patterns. There's some Republican punishment, the exact same amount actually, but still overwhelming majority of Republicans stick by the Republican candidate. And I can show you the results for independents later. We see that independents do levy some punishment on both sides. We're not sure why there's that asymmetry. But the problem is that independents are a small proportion of the electorate, so just not a lot of the punishment is coming from them. It has to really come from the candidate's own party. Okay, couple other things. Right, so against what we had expected, doesn't seem like 2019 had a very long staying power in Democrats' minds. Punishment was identical for both parties. And we found similar patterns, and all of our conclusions were the same in the elite rhetoric and the contested report scenarios. And the conclusions were similar for all the main conclusions held for the vote share as well. Okay, we also looked at partisan double standards. I won't get into the details, but I'll just say there were big double standards, as you can imagine. So voters thinking that the soliciting was much worse when the other side did it than when their own side did it. And, what you can see then is that the fact that Republicans and Democrats disagreed in 2019 and 2020 about whether Trump had done something wrong wasn't anything about Republicans. If the shoe had been on the other foot and the things were flipped, we would have seen very similar dynamics of Democrats just having a completely different view of what had happened. And this was without any elite rhetoric. This is the pure solicitation experiment. They didn't need any nudge to see things differently. Interestingly, once you put in elite rhetoric, those partisan double standards expand. And what we think is going on is that it's sort of convincing each side to move toward, more punishment or less punishment, or more disapproval versus less disapproval. Okay, so conclusion. So just to sort of take out what we think are the main takeaways from our findings. So this is a real glass half empty, glass half full story. So I'll start with the glass half empty, which is the vast majority of Americans were not willing to punish. And that even though Democrats railed against this a few short years ago, they were no more willing to punish than Republicans were. You could also see how candidates could minimize the punishment. They could focus on asking friendly countries. They could avoid explicit quid pro quos. They could get elites to defend them, and they could cultivate uncertainty about what had happened. All of those things diminish the already sort of modest punishment further. But glass half full, there was this small and very persistent minority that punished in all of the situation, nearly every situation that we looked at. The one exception really being punishment of Trump in a few cases, and again, we have a smaller n there. So for the most part, you had this minority that might uphold those norms. So what are the implications of that? Well, we think those punishments might be big enough to actually deter soliciting, at least the sort of worst forms of soliciting, of getting involved with an unfriendly country and offering them foreign policy goodies in turn. We also think this can help explain what types of soliciting would be most likely to happen. So we think that candidates would have the strongest incentives to avoid the things that voters punish the most, like reaching out to enemies or offering quid pro quos. Or it's also possible that this would drive the soliciting underground and that they would still do it, but those would be the types of things they'd be more likely to do secretly. Lots of open questions, right? We only looked at the US. What would happen in other countries? I had an interesting conversation, I think, with one of you about what this might look like in other situations. I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that. Another question is, how did voters come to hold these preferences and these views about foreign meddling and soliciting? And would there be interventions that policymakers could undertake to reduce the pretty high tolerance that we detected? And then what we find in this experiment is that there are these modest penalties, but because we don't have a head-to-head comparison with other types of electoral badness, other kinds of things candidates can do to win elections, we don't know exactly how these penalties compare, and that's really interesting. Is there something about the foreign element that makes this even worse, or is this actually a domain that maybe isn't seen as normatively bad? That's another question for future research. Okay, well, I will stop there and very interested in your thoughts. I'm happy to call on people,
Okay,
but
great.
yeah.
But I'll start with a
Okay, yes.
Thank you for the amazing talk. I mean, as you said, this is a seriously understudied topic, and you shed a lot of light on it. And unfortunately, a topic that might become more and more important in the years ahead. So just one question descriptively. You mentioned political interest level of some of the respondents, whether they lived in a swing state. I was curious about some of the other factors that can mediate responses to the experiment, such as trust in government, education, ideology, a variety of who are the people that are punishing and not punishing.
Well, let me see what I have here. I mean, some of these questions are a little bit hard to answer just because of once you start slicing the data
It's smaller.
more finely.
Yeah.
I think so. We had tested the moderating effects of many of the typical demographic variables that you might think about. The one that it's not exactly a demographic variable, and I'm not sure if I can pluck it out here on short notice, but we did find, okay, let me, sorry. We found, sorry, I'm not going to be able to find
No
it,
worries.
and yeah, I know, I don't want to be on. So we found that one thing that did moderate effect size was strength of partisan attachment. And so, as you might expect, the findings were the punishment is coming more from people who are more indifferent. So people that have strong partisan attachments, they're the least likely to punish. And that's similar to what Graham and Spolik had found in their research on U.S. Democracy violations. But I'm pretty sure that across the other demographic variables, the effects were very consistent. So this wasn't like some not an obvious to us minority that was imposing the punishment. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Great. So this was really interesting. A lot of it reminds me of the research in comparative politics on survey experiments on corruption, so other forms of electoral malfeasance.
Yes.
And there's some sort of stark differences between the effects of those survey experiments and what you find, and I think it might be instructive or useful for trying to understand what you see here. So in general, I think you see it's really easy to move people really strongly against corruption in some of these survey experiments.
Yeah.
So you sort of see huge effects. Then there's a real question about whether why do you see these huge effects in survey experiments, but then when it comes to actual behavior, it seems like punishment of corruption is much more moderated, right?
Yeah.
So like the survey experiments uncover the strong normative preference against corruption, but then when it comes to actual voting behavior, it's much more moderate. So what you see here, though, is like even in this artificial environment, you see only rather moderate punishment of solicitation, right?
Yeah.
And so just thinking about the literature that's out there, these survey experiments on corruption, I mean, some of them are done without attaching partisan identities.
Yes.
And there is a lot of work that
Yes.
suggests that partisanship weakens the punishment of corruption. And some of them are done in contexts where just partisanship is less polarized. There are many parties where partisanship is weaker, right? So, I mean, I would think it would be really interesting to redo this in a primary situation. And then you might uncover, like, holding constant people's partisan attachments, what is their normative evaluation? And, that might, I would expect that you would uncover much more punishment of solicitation if you were comparing two Democratic or two Republican candidates. I don't know if you can speak to that. Right. But that might then help you sort of understand, okay, sort of normative commitments, how, what are they, and how do they weigh against preferences or voting in a highly polarized and bipartisan system, basically.
Right.
So I think that would be really revealing, and in a way, I take your sort of glass half empty takeaway as maybe overly pessimistic. In a context where polarization is strong, there are only two parties, there's no real way to defect from your party. You might really dislike something and still vote for the candidate, and that, I'm not sure that's like bad, if you had, all of your vote choice or preferences are sort of bipolar.
Yeah.
If you had questions about like how, I mean, you do have some questions, so maybe I'd be curious to see more about like how ethical is this person.
Yeah.
Like maybe you would expect to see more movement there. That doesn't then turn into vote choice.
Right.
Anyway, really interesting project and paper.
So thank you, and there's so many interesting things to respond to there. I think a couple things I'll react to. So first, I think you're right that there is a strong normative judgment. Voters don't like this. So right, this is showing you disapproval of the candidate's behavior in the soliciting conditions. And so what you see, so these are just the situations where the soliciting occurred. And so what you see is that there's always majority disapproval. And so we focus, so it's not that voters don't like this, right? So when we were motivating our theory, it was like, well, maybe voters don't actually dislike this, and that's why they wouldn't punish. And we definitely have evidence that they dislike it. We chose to go with a non-primary situation because we were interested in, would they weigh this disapproval? Would that translate into the punishment? I agree with you that probably we would see more punishment in a primary situation where the partisan goals aren't as much on the line. And then you sort of alluded to this really interesting question of, is the US sort of a hard case for finding evidence of punishment or an easy case? And on the one hand, I completely agree with you that it's a hard case in the sense that when you only have two options and they seem so far apart from each other, it's going to take such overwhelming disapproval of the behavior to pull off a supporter, right? To get a Trump voter to defect, to get a Biden voter to defect. On the other hand, I do think something that's happening in the US context that might not be as intense in other countries is the disapproval. I mean, right, so there's kind of two questions. One is, what is the link between the disapproval and the punishment? And I think the US is a hard case for that because the options are so far apart. The other question, though, is what is the level of disapproval? And I think, my hunch would be that American voters would probably disapprove more than voters would in a lot of other countries, right? So we're a superpower. We're used to complete sovereignty over our territory. We're super prickly about giving away sovereignty to international organizations. Other countries seem to have more flexible visions of like living in next to other countries, in some cases are even part of supranational organizations. So I would wonder, I think it's an empirical question whether the disapproval would be as high in some of those other contexts. So what you might see is that punishment ends up being similar because there's a tighter link between disapproval and vote choice because you just shift to like a slightly less bad option, but because the disapproval of the activity is a little lower, the desire to punish isn't as great. So I think it's just to say there's like even another interesting question about the cross-national differences. But thank you for pointing me to the corruption literature, which I don't think we're engaging with now, and we definitely should. Yes. Yeah.
So first off, I just want to say this was awesome. I really like the setup of the three experiments, like really trying to get at that motivated reasoning thing. So I had a couple different questions. One, I think I had a question very similar for Rebecca, and I think, and so you've already kind of addressed it, but I was like interested in like trying to understand like what you mean by punishment.
Yeah.
It does seem to like be like a reaction to disapproval. So I was trying to figure out like,
Yeah.
do you want them to like stop voting? Is it the idea that they vote for the other party?
Mm-hmm.
So I had a question like that. So I mean, I don't know if you need to answer that, but
Yeah.
the other thing I was really curious about, and I guess I'm asking you to slice the data even more, but like I was
Yeah.
really interested in like the friend or foe condition.
Yeah.
And in particular, I'm just wondering if like I guess you asked any manipulation checks afterwards in regards to like if they knew it was an ally. Because I'm wondering, I guess, so like when you're describing like the project at large, one question I had that was related to I guess like intervening in other countries is like this idea of like the role of U.S. in foreign policy. So particularly like when the Republican Party right now, I think there's like a debate as to whether or not there should be more interventionist or isolationist. And so like when I'm looking at like Russia, I'm like, I feel like there's some groups that think like Russia's actually an ally. So like in terms of like slicing the data, I'd be really interested in like learning the country-based effects, and then also kind of like as like a scholar of race, be interested in thinking like, okay, well, who is the country? Like, what is that population? And like, what do the public actually think about it? That'd be really interested in understanding.
Right.
I think I had one other thing. Oh, and I don't know if you do plan to run any more studies, but one thing I thought would be really cool is that because you are using real candidates, like this would be a really good time to do like repeated measure design, just to given like how many different conditions you have. I feel like it'd be really cool to have to do like within subjects look at it. But yeah,
Right.
awesome project. I really
Okay,
like this.
yes. Okay, so many good
Yeah,
things to
sorry.
respond to there. I don't have the findings broken out by enemy, by specific country here. And you are slicing it very thinly
Yeah.
because you're dividing the data by 5, and it's already a pretty demanding experiment. I would say I would acknowledge that there could be things other than friendly, unfriendly that are driving the results, right? So our allies are democracies, our non-allies are non-democracies, right? So this could be influencing reactions, and so it'd be really interesting to tease those things apart. You could design an experiment that would do that, and we're just not able to do that here.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was your second question? I just lost my thread.
It was, I guess,
Or the
like,
third.
I was saying, like, if you are planning on running an additional study, I feel like because you're using real candidates, like, it'd be a really good candidate for, like, repeat measure design.
Yes. So
again,
So contacting the same people that we surveyed back in January again, or
so, like, you would measure, like, the dependent variable treatment.
Mm.
Recent article, they, like, try to
okay.
the demand effects.
I know what you're talking about.
Just kind of helps you
Yeah, yeah.
decisions. So, like, considering how many different factors you, like, manipulate, I think
Right.
you're really going to try to, like, increase that power, so maybe you could slice it a little bit. So you're just measuring the DV before the treatment, then after.
Yeah, okay. Right, we explicitly didn't take that approach. We didn't want people to be encountering the same candidate multiple times because we didn't want it to be confusing for them about what had happened. But it could be a very efficient way to use data, so we'll have to think about whether we could do that in a way that wouldn't mess up our design. Yeah, Jeff?
Jessica, thank you for coming back to Brown. Please don't start another pandemic.
I will try.
My
Everyone
throat
wash their
hurts a
hands.
little bit. I want to pick up a little bit off of something Marcus said. I'm wondering about what you're measuring, I think, is sort of the intensity of preference change, right? Or the degree to which we disapprove of this.
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to me like another question about sort of the duration of that disapproval, right? So just stepping back from the experiment altogether, thinking about Trump,
Mm-hmm.
we have a guy who literally did this. He was caught. He was impeached. We have a mountain of evidence about it. And he's still, on track to be the Republican nominee and potentially the next president.
Mm-hmm.
A 9-point swing
Mm-hmm.
is a large amount in U.S. elections, right? And so I'm wondering about the degree to which that 9-point, on average, 9-point degree of disapproval has staying power. Whether we react instantaneously and think when it's right in front of us, wow, that's a bad thing, you shouldn't have done that. And tomorrow I just don't care anymore because I'm on to the next thing that has come up in the headlines.
So this is interesting, and I'm going to deploy your point when I debrief with my co-author because I think we.
No, you can't tell Mike that this is my.
I definitely will. Well, he has been okay. So I've been a little bit more on the glass half empty side. Like, this is bad. Like, most people don't change their vote, and 2 to 3 percentage points in some of these situations to me feels very precariously low. He's like, 2 to 3 percentage points, that'll win you or lose you a U.S. election. This will definitely deter candidates. And I'm caricaturing our positions a little bit, but you do raise a really good point about we are sort of probably capturing the largest effect because we're asking right when the information is salient and they don't have that much other information. And so imagine that this were something that had happened before, but then you forget about it and other events percolate. So would your...
And like the next day, there's a mass shooting in a school.
Yeah, and so your other policy position becomes more salient and you're like, well, I did care about...
Right.
Right. So you're like, I did care about electoral intervention and soliciting, but today I just gotta
got a whole
vote
new set
by...
of information.
Yeah. Okay. I'll anonymize this comment.
No, you can blame it on me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yes, in the red. Yes.
Hey, Paulus. Thank you so much. Really beautiful talk. Tremendously presented. Super interesting. A couple of comments masquerading as questions. And
Yes.
So picking up on the point I think Jeff brought up, I had a sort of similar thought about kind of the scope conditions to this, which is, had you run this study in 2008, you were super prescient about FEI, like what would we have expected to have found?
Yeah.
Right? Would there have been more punishment of in-party, out-party, because we do have this kind of like, you can think of it as a dirty pool, or
Yeah.
people are already primed to think about this in ways that is interesting. And so I wonder sort of how long, like, Trump persists in shaping the way we think about this. Like, will we eventually go back to normal? And then maybe back to some of like Rebecca's points. Like, I too am a little more kind of glass half full. I think it depends on whether you're drinking or pouring in general. But in that, like, if I think about like the way you opened the talk, I was sort of like, oh, I wonder how these norms ever persist if the public doesn't care.
Yeah.
And yet, it seems like a 9 percentage point swing is enough for risk-averse politicians to say, not worth it. Even if I could pull this off, it's probably like, and then there are the other institutional factors, possibility of punishment, all sorts of other things that would make a norm against soliciting, I think, actually operational. And so I am less concerned maybe seeing this, or more, I guess I'm still concerned about solicitation, but I think I'm still of the mind that like a norm can persist to prevent this kind of thing. And then I had like a methodological clarification
Yeah.
question, which is just when you were presenting these designs, I was 2 by 2 by 2. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, we're going to see another sort of conjoint, but it doesn't seem like it's actually a conjoint. It is an interesting comparison, and so I don't quite understand the control conditions. It seems like they're very low information, right? And so you
It was
don't
just
get
a horse race, essentially.
just horse race
Yeah.
versus like this much longer vignette, right? And
Yeah.
so those aren't exactly apples to apples in that like I could see me saying like, shouldn't there be some filler information that should be anyways, that's minor.
Okay.
But,
Yeah.
I-
Okay. I have to think about what other.
like my evaluation of the horse race is different than my evaluation of a vignette. Might be the sort of like I'm just more cognitively engaged through taxing, and so they don't seem quite necessarily like the sort of counterfactual.
Okay. Yeah, I know. I want to think about that one some more. But that's an interesting point.
It's an annoying point.
Yeah.
I don't think about it.
Regarding the 2008 experiment, I feel like you're a committed political scientist when time travel is invented, and you're like, I'm going to field my experiment in 2008. Maybe invest in the stock market on the side, or strategically. But we just do not know where these what the beliefs would have been back then, and I honestly do wish that we could figure that out. But now the world has been tainted by what happened. As to the 9 percentage points, I mean, that is an average. That's like that includes cases of a candidate asking like North Korea to meddle in our election and then to move our military forces in a way that North Korea would like. So there are some really extreme cases in there, and I think for sure our findings, and this is where my co-author would say, yeah, exactly, no U.S. candidate is ever going to do that because that would be political poison if it were discovered. I think on the glass half empty side, I would point to the fact that when you look at some of these situations and you bring in the elite justifications, or you bring in the uncertainty, and you ask an ally and you ask something, you don't have a quid pro quo, suddenly you're in 2 to 3% land, and then you think of, well, the fact that it might not be present in people's minds, and you think about something which I didn't mention much, but that maybe this won't even get detected, then I start to think, well, candidates may do this. So I want to think more about your point also about how the norm would persist if there isn't consistent punishment. And I don't have a good answer to that, but I will think about it. Yes.
Just
Yes.
a general question. Have there been things looked at relative to like a success, whatever the picture of successful achieving that quid pro quo, like what the results would be? Because I
Eric
feel
Adams. That was my other.
Eric Adams.
I feel like relative to a loss of 9%, there can't possibly be
Oh.
anything that would make it worthwhile.
Right. I mean, this gets at the question of right, so an extension to this would be to think through what risk of detection would be needed and what electoral benefit would be needed, and what, which depends on the certainty that the target of soliciting would actually come to your aid. Like how much benefit would be needed to offset these different penalties. So we haven't done that analysis for this paper. And that is, so right, if the electoral benefits on average, according to Dov-Levin, are only about 3 percentage points, then you only need a tiny little deterrent potentially to make that not worthwhile. Yeah. I saw a hand over, yes.
Thanks again for the great talk. I guess if you take foreign electoral intervention, one question I have is if you take it as a form of democratic norm breaking, democratic erosion. One way we think about it is that democratic norms are not really among the voters potentially punished, but really it's an elite pact between elite Republicans and elite Democrats. And the punishment of a norm violation is not just I don't get elected, it's also the other side is then going to engage in the same practice. So think of gerrymandering for an example, right? So then it becomes this, well, we have to also gerrymander because they're gerrymandering.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, maybe you could speculate about that, because obviously it's beyond the scope of the experiment, but just thinking about democratic norms in this way, is it possible that there's a second punishment that is hiding? And then, if so, what does that mean for the punishment coming from your own party?
Right.
That's kind of your finding. But it seems that norm violations should also have an out-party punishment. It's just a different kind of punishment.
Okay, so you're thinking the fact that Republicans defended Trump should provoke Democrats to defend Biden if he did this, which should deter Republicans in the first place? Yeah.
Or maybe a different way to think about it is, if Trump is going to solicit intervention in this coming election, and we anticipate that will have a big effect, shouldn't Democrats, given the huge stakes of the election, also do the same? And then the norm is broken.
Yes, I'm worried about that. And I think the fact that Democratic voters seem not to care that their Democratic elites were being super hypocritical by defending the exact same behavior, and they were just as persuaded by the rhetoric, nearly as persuaded as Republican voters were, is very worrisome, right? So the fact that you don't see any historical memory, I think is worrisome, right? And so, yes, knowing that, maybe if we had started out in 2019 with Republicans taking a different response to the Trump phone call, then that would have been good, but that's not what happened. We got off sort of in the wrong equilibrium. So the equilibrium we're in now, I think, is very worrisome.
So it'd be at like a downward spiral.
Yeah, we're in a downward spiral. If things had gone differently in 2019, maybe that logic would have worked, but like that's gone. Rebecca, did you have your hand?
Yeah, I was on the Mayor Adams thing. That's another thing that would be interesting to do, to look at intervention in subnational politics where partisanship is less heightened, less relevant, and where you might see more willingness to move away from a candidate.
Yes. We actually have fielded an experiment. The project is sort of dormant, but we looked at reactions to out-of-state spending on in-state candidates. And we found relatively little concern about it. Is that sort of what you have in mind?
Well, Mayor Adams right now, it talks about who can enforce norms. He's being investigated for soliciting and engaging in a quid pro quo with the Turkish government to help them build their, I forget what, consulate or something to the UN in New York City. It's pretty clear that's what happened.
I'm sorry, I was going off on a different tangent. Yeah.
So, but just saying foreign intervention in local elections is probably less present. Local elections in general are less highly polarized in terms of partisanship. So that might be a place where you see the real strong negative reaction that you're looking for. Yes. And the other thing is just if you ask me if Biden solicited whatever from North Korea and blah, 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 and then the other candidate was Trump, I would be like, yeah, I'll vote for Biden. So like without revealing. So I'm, you know, the realism of some of these scenarios is so implausible that I'm not sure that you're actually recovering like people's real opinions, or just like this is like cuckoo land. So like,
So what do you think that would do?
so I think that's weakening your punishment basically. So you're saying people punish less when it's an ally. And so what are you saying? They're saying they punish more when it's a non-ally. But
Yeah.
I would expect if you tell me a non-ally with, you know, most of these candidates except for Trump, I'd be like, that's totally implausible. So then I'm just going to ignore that. And so then that should actually like reduce the punishment that you recover.
So this is something, a comment I've heard before. And so we looked into, do both friends and non-friends intervene in U.S. elections? I mean, ideally what we would want to see is, do candidates solicit
Right.
both allies and non-allies? And we just don't have the historical information on that. What we do have from like Levin's work, and also Nikolai Marinov has a whole interesting project where they've collected a bunch of data, and they can answer the question of, are friends versus enemies more likely to intervene in elections, in foreign elections, and they find there's really no difference, that both kinds of countries do. So that part of it, at least, is plausible.
Sure, but the solicitation, right, is in, I mean, maybe it's like people come with this motivated reasoning, so they find implausible the normatively suspect behavior by their own co-partisan. Anyway.
Yeah.
We
Okay.
could
Yeah,
you
I would just
disagree.
say I have the opposite reaction,
Okay,
in the
so-
sense that if either candidate, Republican or Democrat, asked for Justin Trudeau's endorsement, I think who cares, right? Americans don't care about Justin Trudeau's opinion on this, and so there's some threshold of like, what's actually intervention? Like,
Yeah.
how serious does it get?
Yeah. Right. Yes.
Yeah, really interesting talk on a surprisingly understudied subject. In that regard, I'm wondering, do you have any comparison to is there a literature on foreign political lobbying? Because basically, what you're talking about is trying to influence who gets elected, but in some ways it's similar to trying to influence how those who are elected vote, right? So political lobbying, and you know, I remember a couple of years ago, you know, New York Times had a investigative piece showing that Toyota had systematically lobbied and funded U.S. politicians who were voting against electric cars, because Toyota was actually behind their rivals. And I thought this was scandalous, but didn't seem to have any effect whatsoever in people's views of Toyota. It's still the most popular hybrid and so on. So is there a parallel comparisons you can make to foreign political lobbying? Because it's obviously, the end result is they want to influence U.S. politics.
Yeah. So when you say comparison we could make, like, to how voters evaluate the foreign lobbying, or?
I mean, it's striking that you say this is an understudied subject and
Yeah.
you have your results. I'm just wondering how it compares, knowing nothing about this literature. Are you aware of the parallel literature, if there is one, on political lobbying? Because they seem to be kind of in the same universe.
That's so interesting. And I actually have a colleague to whom I'm married who has a data set on foreign lobbying, and never once have we had this conversation.
He won't
So-
share it with you.
Yeah, right. So I will ask him. I don't think that there's a parallel literature on this question. The most parallel literatures I know are on just the domestic norm violation, and then I need to look into the corruption literature more. But thank you. That's really an interesting area to go further. Thank you. Yes.
Can I quickly just ask a question about how much does the mode of how solicitation is done impact the punishment also? I know you listed out those 5, but then you also initially mentioned that there is covert versus overt ways to do it. So I'm just wondering, especially thinking about like like, more cyber attacks, or thinking about ways in which online misinformation is spread, where attribution is really hard to do, and attribution might not really mean that it's going back to a state actor per se, it could be a non-state actor. So then how does that impact the salience of, oh, okay, I recognize I'm associating this foreign actor with supporting this person, and also how much I'm willing to punish them, because there might be so much ambiguity in this, like the way in which they're helping, that I might feel better about not punishing. So if you can elaborate a little bit on those dynamics.
Yeah, so these are the requests that we varied, and we did not find major differences between these 5. But that does, do you think some of these are obviously worse than others? Because we did choose ones that seemed plausible, in part because there is some gray area about them legally. Like the whole question of who's allowed to buy online ads, even if that, openly even, is a little, it's a little less restricted than you might think, but then also, you can circumvent whatever the laws are. So we picked ones that maybe were a bit more in the gray area. So I suspect that if we had compared like an endorsement to hacking into voting machines, that there we would see a big difference, but we just didn't have the data for that in this study. So yeah, we didn't see big differences here, but it's really, I think that's also a really interesting question. So maybe you could categorize, maybe you could have sort of interventions that seem to much more clearly violate norms and laws, and you would probably get much larger punishments. And that is important to take into account in the context of like, how big is this punishment? Just to remember that this is what we mentioned. Yes.
Thank you. So I have 2 questions. First, this is related to Lior's point. I'm wondering whether the punishment is due to concerns about ethics, competence, or policy premises. I think if it differs between non-allies and allies, it might be a result of like policy preferences. And also, my second question is, I'm really interested in your other ongoing project about Americans' perceptions of U.S. interference. So I'm wondering, like, if you can talk about the results.
Yes. Well, okay, maybe I'll just, where are we on?
This should probably be the last.
Okay.
Section.
So I'll just maybe focus on that second question. So we have a separate experiment that looks at reactions to foreign meddling, U.S. meddling in other countries' elections. And what we find is that Americans tend to think it's normatively suspect, but kind of tend to tolerate it anyway. So they're somewhat, I don't know what word you want to use, realpolitik in their views on that. We find that they're much more likely to support it when it's effective than ineffective. Not shockingly, but that fact leads to some really interesting dynamics. Like often because Americans tend to support U.S. intervention in foreign elections when it works, it means that for U.S. leaders, if they can get that successful win, often there is a political benefit to that because voters surprisingly often will prefer that outcome to having stayed out and losing the election. So there's a lot of situations in which there could be public opinion incentives actually to intervene, certainly not disincentives. There's also a lot higher U.S. support for doing that when there's rival intervention. And actually, Dov Levin and I think Paul Musgrave have an article that also finds something similar. So there's a worry about sort of intervention spirals that, like, if there's an election in France and Americans learn that Russia has intervened in that election, they're much more likely. Like, it changes their entire perspective of what the U.S. should do. So going back to the idea of these like normative cascades, that's kind of worrisome. But yeah, I'm happy to chat with you more about that if you want.
Great. Well, thank you so much for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
And I hope